Thanks everyone for coming. Good to see a lot of familiar faces today. So I'm really excited to talk about this topic because this paper was published just last week. So I'm excited to talk about it and share our results. And if you're interested, you can find it online as of now. And so we, over the last 2 years or so, this data that I'm going to present today is basically the result of two separate efforts that then came together. One by the Protected Areas Commission in Guyana, who's doing baseline surveys on resource use in a new protected area called the Conacook Mountains, and then a regional camera trap study that was related to my PhD, and then work I've been doing since here at UF. And then we brought those two data sets together to try to understand what does the impact of the current state of hunting in and around the protected area look like. And so we had huge teams. These are the co-authors here. This is Asaf, who's one of the co-authors on the paper, but also a key member of our camera trapping team, and a local hunter himself who helped verify the data that the trends in the data based on what he's seen in his lifetime on the ground. So I think we're all very familiar with the writings and the trends about hunting in the tropics, that hunting has already reached unsustainable levels across large parts of the tropics, and some scholars call it the most pressing threat to tropical forests after deforestation. Determining sustainable harvest for many tropical species and neotropical species has been difficult to do because of the lack of study and the elusive nature of the species themselves. But we do know that losing or having population declines of many of these species interrupt or impact key ecosystem functions that can undermine tropical forest ecology. So it's a key issue of concern for tropical forest managers, scholars, academics, and local communities alike. I think one of the things that really shocked me when I first started working in tropical forests in Guyana is that these habitats, particularly for large mammals, are very low productivity. And so, you know, I had always assumed that these sea of broccoli that you would see from overhead in tropical forests were, you know, a wonderland for all sorts of species. But, you know, after working there and reading and stuff, you come to find out, or you realize, that much of this green that you see is inaccessible for the large mammals who live on the ground. So much of it is up in the forest canopy, so not many tapirs and deer can climb up 200 feet to access the leaves in the forest canopy, and then many of them have structural and chemical defenses that make them difficult to digest or feed on in general. So that means that there isn't, comparatively to like African savannas, there isn't a ton of food available for neotropical herbivores and frugivores, and therefore they exist at naturally low densities, which can make these species susceptible to overhunting even from the start. We know from studies that hunters prefer large-bodied species to others that are available, and that these large-bodied species are disproportionately impacted by hunting effort. This was, I think, from Pires 2000, that showed that under light hunting, these sort of large size class of mammals can persist, but then once hunting pressure gets into these moderate and heavy hunting intensity classes, that populations decline rather quickly, and then you have cascading effects that reach back to medium and small mammals who would have initial declines related to hunting pressure and then increases as they're released from competitive pressure. There have been some studies that have tried to look at a wide variety of site-specific studies on the impact of hunting, and we know that across the board, game mammals and birds declined by 83% and 58% under moderate and heavy hunting pressure, which is concerning because sustainable hunting is considered to be, I think, around 20% of the take for each year. And so this seems to be exceeding the offtake for what we know is sustainable. And just in the neotropics, studies have documented declines of tapir, several species of deer, white-lipped peccary, giant armadillos, and more. And so one of the broader questions that we had, in addition to informing the management of this one protected area, is could we look at an area of very low hunting intensity and try to understand what is the impact of this sort of very low base level, and then compare it to what's going on elsewhere to help hone in on what are sustainable levels of offtake for some of these large-bodied forest species. So to do that, I'm going to have to bring you to Guyana, and I always use this map just to clear up any confusion of where we're talking about. So we're talking about formerly British Guyana, right here next to Venezuela and Brazil and Suriname. French Guyana is over here, farther to the east, and Ghana, of course, across the ocean. I still have a lot of, until I have relatives that can understand that I haven't been working in Africa all these years, I'll keep putting this map in all the presentations that I do. But Guyana, so Guyana itself is it's actually separate from the Amazon basin. We're looking at strict hydrological basins, and it's part of the Guyana Shield. So all of other than the Takatu River, which runs from north to south along Guyana's border with Brazil, all the other rivers in the Guyana Shield run from south to north and into the Atlantic Ocean. This Guyana Shield forest is one of the largest intact forests in the world, and Guyana has the second highest forest cover by land area, and first is Suriname, which is right next door, and I think third is French Guyana, which is just next door again. So this is a very low deforestation area. So the deforestation is in red here. This is natural neotropical savanna. I wish this map showed the boundary, but it's right here between, this is the Brazil side, Suriname is here, French Guyana is here. Most of the red that you're seeing in here is related to gold mining, both legal and illegal. But the overall deforestation rate is very low, 0.04%. And this is primarily due to strict regulations by the Guyana Forestry Commission, which are also, in my opinion, very well enforced. And Guyana Shield forests have a relatively low number of commercially viable species compared to other forest types. So most of the most valuable timber species in Guyana, there are a handful of them, I think less than 5. And so by nature, almost all of the forestry in Guyana, large parts of the northern 2/3 of Guyana are broken up into forestry and mining concessions. But most of that, the vast majority of that forestry is selective, and so it's only going after 3, 4, 5 species and leaving, for the most part, the forest standing. Wild meat, the market for wild meat in Guyana is steadily increasing. A study that was just done 2 years ago found that the consumption in Guyana's capital is comparable to that in the cities in the Amazon basin. So 0.2 tons per kilometer squared per year, still much lower than the Congo basin where wild meat consumption is high. That said, wild meat is consumed openly in Guyana and sold openly and marketed openly. This is a very common thing to see in the capital and in restaurants and stores along roadsides. Laba is lowland paka, that's a Creole name. Wild cow is lowland tapir. Deer, there are 3 species of deer that are commercially marketed, and then these are a catfish and a peacock bass, is a local Creole name. So the market for wild meat is growing. In terms of demand, the markets themselves are becoming more abundant, larger, and I would say dealing with more and more meat each year. And at the same time, infrastructure in Guyana is improving. So access to these markets from the interior has improved. That's been one of the major limiting factors in the past. Guyana's interior only has a single road, and it's unpaved. So historically, it was unpassable for large parts of the rainy season. And I see Brady's been on it, so I see him shaking his head. It's pretty rough, but it's ever improving. Cell signal has come to the region, more and more air services, and all these things facilitate the movement of wild meat or bush meat to the coast. Couple that with changing economic conditions and a general lack of employment opportunities in the interior, and people are seeking to meet that demand because it's one of the few areas that people in the interior can generate some income. Guyana also has a very new and growing protected areas system. So Guyana currently has 5 protected areas. They have one of the oldest, Kaicher Falls, one of the oldest protected areas in South America. And then they went, I don't know, more than 100 years without creating a new protected area. And most of these were, 3 of the 5 were created in 2010. And then a large community-owned protected area just last year. That said, the president of Guyana has committed to having a protected area in all of Guyana's 10 regions. This map doesn't show the region, but there are 10 sub-regions. Right now, 3 of the protected areas are all in one region, Region 9. There are several smaller regions on the coast. And so the president's committed to having a protected area in each region by 2020. And Guyana's international commitments through the Convention on Biological Diversity requires that Guyana have 17% of their land cover in protected areas by 2020, which is next year as well. I think currently they're at about 6%, so they have a ways to go. And their commitments under the Paris Agreement requires that they increase their protected area system by 2 million hectares. I think that's by 2025. So there's been a large-scale effort in the Protected Areas Commission to identify prospective new protected areas. This analysis took into consideration both unique habitats that currently aren't under protection, as well as the ease of creating a new protected area. So like creating a protected area here on the coast, while there might be mangrove and other unique habitat, creating a protected area within an urban landscape will be more difficult than somewhere out here where nobody lives and it's all forest. And so they prioritize a number of new areas and are taking those things under consideration as we speak. So this study was focused in the Kanaku Mountains protected area. I began working here in 2012, before it was a protected area, while I was doing my master's research. And then in 2015, it was officially designated as a protected area. Here's what it looks like from one of the mountain tops. It's 611,000 hectares of intact tropical forest. Much of it is not inaccessible, but people don't use much of the interior of the forest. It's considered one of Guyana's richest protected areas in terms of biodiversity. And part of that is because of where it sits. So this is looking back. Before we were actually on top of this mountain looking in the other direction, and now we're back out in the savanna in a community called Napi, looking towards the forest. So the protected area boundary would be somewhere in here, near the forest savanna. This is a natural forest savanna boundary. And the reason that this area is so diverse is because you have these 2 distinct habitats coming in close contact with one another, distinct species on both sides, as well as an elevational gradient. And only these highest mountains start to transition into cloud forest, but you do have some unique sort of high forest species. Most of the communities around the KMPA look like this, maintain traditional lifestyles, traditional livelihoods, hunting, fishing, and farming for the most part, but that is changing. So the protected area is surrounded by 21 communities. Like I said, largely farmers, fishermen, and hunters. And this area of the world has one of the lowest human population densities around, less than 1 person per square kilometer. So if you're looking for some space and some peace and quiet, this might be a place that you look into moving. Here's again in the mountains now looking back, and you can see the distinct forest savanna boundary coming from here. The communities that live around the KMPA have been using this area long before it was a protected area. So I've yet to, in all the years we've been tromping around setting camera traps, I've yet to find a rubber tree that hasn't been tapped sometime in its life. And there have been times where you think like, oh, we're the first people who have ever set foot in this part of the mountains. And then you look up and you see this old tree with all these rubber markings, and you realize that that's a fairy tale that you make up in your head. But so these communities have been responsible for this protected area as stewards for millennia. They've been using the place responsibly, and they're the ones who are responsible for the current high forest cover and high biodiversity. I think one of the reasons why when I first went to Guyana, I wanted to start doing research there is because I was seeing that these communities had been doing a wonderful job maintaining traditional management systems and cultural beliefs and practices. But you can see that those things are eroding away relatively quickly as the region experiences rapid changes, economic, social, and environmental, places getting drier and hotter with more fires in the savanna every year. And the global economy is coming to this region very quickly. So when I went here 10 years ago, the first time, I knew everyone in the region who had a vehicle. There were only about 5. And everybody, almost to a T, communicated using CB radio. So if you wanted to go to a next community, you had to call ahead on CB radio and hail to them, and then wait while they ran and found the person that you were looking for and brought them back. Now, everyone made a jump from CB radio directly to smartphone with no steps in between. Cell phone coverage covers much of the region, and there's a high demand for jobs and material stuff and so on, but very little availability. So this is where we were working, what we did to try to understand the impact of current hunting. And I said this is where we brought together these 2 data sets. So the PAC, with support from Franklin Zoological Society, did a widespread and very intense effort at doing household surveys on knowledge, activities, and practices. That's the acronym KAP, these CAP surveys. They surveyed 815 households across the 21 communities. And relevant to, they asked about all sorts of things related to resource use, but relevant to our study, they got a good handle on the number of households that were hunting, the species that people were targeting, the perceptions of population trends in these species, and also details about how people were hunting and where, when, what time of year, like a hunting calendar, how many people were going out, what were they using, all of these kinds of details. After the CAP surveys, they followed up with a participatory resource mapping activity to map out the locations of key hunting, fishing, farming, important cultural areas, and so on. They went back a 3rd time and verified all of this information through focus groups, so to make sure that people weren't just making up stories in their surveys. And then went back a 4th time, presented all of the data to open village meetings, and used a participatory voting approach to verify all of this, that all this information was correct. So a very robust data set on resource use in the region. We brought this together with a camera trapping data set that started with my master's, continued with my PhD dissertation, and then has continued to build on up to now. And so overall, this survey ranges from 2012 to 2017. We were setting 1 camera per site, 2 to 3 kilometers apart. Overall, we had camera trap data from 475 sites in the region, and that's across 16 communities, 5 ranches, 2 protected areas, including the Kanaku Mountains. And we trained and employed about 100 people on a part-time basis. Some of them regularly, some of them only work for us once or something. That all range. So in an effort to bring these 2 data sets together, we plotted out where all of our camera trap sites were on top of where all of the known hunting areas were, and looked for areas where those 2 data sets overlapped. The PAC had hunting and resource use data on all 21 communities that surround the Kanaku Mountains. So you can see that all the communities are here on this western side. There are no people living over on the eastern side of Kanaku Mountains. But some communities, these 2 communities, still access the western side by foot and boat going on this side. So people will still go relatively long distances to access resources. So we organized our camera trap data by hunting intensity. So we knew how many households from each community were hunting and where those hunting areas were located. So we're able to calculate hunting intensity in a given area. Some communities use the same area, so we would add those households and then come up with a hunting intensity, which we defined as the number of households hunting in an area. We eliminated areas where we didn't have both types of data, and in the end, ended up using camera trap data from 221 sites, over 8,000 trap nights, 17,000 occasions, and documented 102 species in that data set. So our analyses, we analyzed 3 different things to try to understand or get an idea of the impact that hunting pressure might be having. We looked at occupancy first, and we interpreted shifts in occupancy as the most severe reaction to hunting. So if animals were locally extinct or were moving away from an area related to, and we see that that trend was related to hunting, we would see that as a severe response. We looked at relative abundance, which is just the number of photos or the number of occurrences per 100 trap nights, as sort of the next most severe response. So animals, the species were persisting in an area, but less abundant than when compared to non-hunted areas. And then we looked at activity patterns. So animals are still there, they're still in a similar abundance, but they're shifting. We would perceive shifts in activity patterns away from peak hunting times as a response to avoiding hunter activity. And so we took different approaches to each, and each step actually added a layer to our data that allowed us to, I think, interpret what was going on more holistically. In terms of the results from the survey, so we found that overall 25% of households hunt both in the protected area and in the surrounding village titled lands, but there was a big range. So there was one community that only 2% of households hunted, and another community where 61% hunted, and there was a range in between. We found that 62% of those households hunted for both home use and commercial sale. That was much higher than we were anticipating. Because most people would, if you ask them straight away, they would say, oh, no, I don't sell wild meat, I just hunt for home and I share with my family and so on. But we found that people will, if they can, opportunistically hunt for both home use and sale. Overall, 18 out of the 21 communities reported hunting. All the communities hunted in their own titled land. 18 of the 21 also hunt within the protected area boundaries, which is allowed by Guyana's protected area system bylaws. All the protected areas are category 6 and they allow for subsistence activities, hunting, fishing, and small scale farming. So we found that the hunting occurred in small groups, people going out mostly with dogs, using primarily bow and arrow, but sometimes firearms. So gun laws in Guyana are very strict, and guns and ammunition are very, very expensive. And they're really stringently enforced. So people are one of the biggest concerns with camera trapping is that people don't want to get caught photographed with a rifle in their hand that is likely illegal because the penalties are very stiff. I've made it a widely known policy that I throw away all pictures of people that I get so people don't have to worry, but it's one of the biggest concerns. And people, from what I've seen, most people hunt with a bow and arrow on one shoulder and a rifle on the other. And if they save the rifle for if the jaguar's bearing down on them and they have to, not that that happens, but that's the perception. And then if you're hunting for food, anything other than probably it's up here, you would use your bow and arrow. And save that ammunition for when you really need it. We found that hunting intensity peaked around key celebrations, so Christmas, and in Guyana, September is Amerindian Heritage Month. So it's a month-long celebration that has competitions and sports and things like that, and hunting peaked around those times, as well as the peak fruiting in the rainy season. So when all the fruits are dropping, people know to hang around those fruiting trees. And then the driest parts of the dry season, people know to hang around watering that persists. The largest animals were sought after, especially around holiday meals. So people don't usually, we found that people don't typically hunt tapir, especially all the time. But at Christmas, Easter, Heritage Month, that big animal serves a lot of people. So meet a lot of need with not as much effort. And we found that hunting intensity varied across our sites, but was all sites showed that hunting intensity was low in comparison to other areas in the Amazon or in broader. So broadly, less than one household per square kilometer is considered a sustainable level of hunting. And all of our highest intensity site was 0.43 households per square kilometer of hunting. So half of that, what you would expect to be a sustainable level of hunting. And that's I think like a keystone that's been in the literature for a long time and has been verified several times. And our study verified that keystone level as well. But we were able to test what was going on in along a gradient of hunting intensities that all fell below that level. We did find in our surveys with local hunters that there was a strong correlation between the species that people preferred the most and the percentage of people that identified that species as less available than 10 years ago. So the lowland paca is by far the favorite animal for people to eat in Guyana, and also the most frequently identified as the species that's less common, and it went on down the line, peccary and deer, black curassow. Some of these species, tapir, giant armadillos, capybara, have local taboos in association with their use. So those things are starting to go away, but we found in the surveys that some people still follow them, and so they won't hunt, like tapir, capybara, giant armadillo, caiman, jaguar. You're not supposed to hunt across the board, but particularly if you have small children in your house, and almost every household has small children in villages. So that's why if you compared this data to probably somewhere else from the Amazon, maybe it wouldn't have the same trends, but I think that explains some of this variation, why some game species are a little bit lower down the list. But the top 5 were common across all of our sites. Lowland paca, always the favorite. Number 2 varied between peccaries and deer. Red-rumped agouti was usually 3rd, and then lowland tapir falling in somewhere behind there, as well as armadillos. So from our occupancy model, we had a couple of variables that we added in to see, to test detection probability as an influencer over our models. We found that trail type was not a good predictor for any species, which was an interesting result because there have been several studies that show that trail type matters. It influences camera trap data because some species prefer to walk trails, other species don't. I know John's work in Ecuador has shown that. I think that the reason for this in our site is because our site included no roads whatsoever. There are no roads into the protected area at all. And the trails, there's no real tourism industry. So the trails that we did use were like foot trails that hunters will use once a month or once every 6 months or something. So they weren't like heavily worn trails. So I think animals are just kind of walking wherever they would walk naturally. We did find that season influenced our detection, with lowland tapir, jaguar, and ocelots being significantly captured at a significantly higher rate in the dry season, whereas collared peccary, paca, coochie, gray-winged trumpeter in the rainy season. I failed to mention, but we chose, so of the 102 species that we documented, we chose 17 to include in our analysis. All of the game species that were identified by the surveys. We included 4 of the 8 carnivore species in the area, so we could try to understand mammal community issues, and then a few species that were of conservation interest, like giant anteaters, which aren't hunted and aren't a consumer, but are sort of a generalist on the landscape. And so the rest of the species that aren't listed here had no relationship with season at all in terms of their detection. So the primary variables that we tested against our occupancy models were forest cover, distance from village, and hunting intensity to try to see what the relationships were. Forest cover was by far the strongest predictor of occurrence, with 11 of the 17 species showing a significant relationship. Red coochie, black curassow, collared peccary, both brocket deer, gray-winged trumpeter, paca, and agouti all had a significant positive relationship with forest cover. Makes sense, these are all forest species. They require large forested areas. And then crab-eating fox, giant anteater, and white-tailed deer all had a significant negative relationship with forest cover, which again makes sense because these are primarily savanna species. Giant anteater we've gotten them on camera traps all over the region, in the highest mountains, the lowest swamps, out in the savanna, but they're definitely far more abundant in the open savanna itself. So only 4 species showed significant relationships with distance to village. Lowland tapir and long-nosed armadillos were the only game species that didn't show a significant relationship with forest cover, so they are most readily using the savanna habitat. But they also showed a significant relationship with increasing distance from villages. So they are using savannas, but they're avoiding village areas as much as they can when they're using that savanna habitat. And then white-tailed deer and crab-eating fox showed significant negative relationships with distance to village, and that makes sense. They're savanna species, again, all of the villages are in the savanna along the forest edge, so by proxy they're in close proximity to one another. And we only had one statistically significant relationship with hunting intensity, and that was the crab-eating fox, which showed a significant positive relationship with hunting intensity. And I think this is because they're scavengers, so they're probably likely scavenging in hunting areas. They also, a large proportion of their diet comes from fruits, and like every village everywhere, there are mango trees, cashew trees, sapodilla, all kinds of things that you can think of, and they also are known to scavenge on village edges on fruits. None of the other game species showed a significant negative relationship between occupancy and hunting intensity, which again reiterates that hunting is currently likely at a sustainable level. When we looked at relative abundance, we saw a lot of interesting variation that was hard to explain away simply. So what we did was, because we know that there's been a lot of criticism of relative abundance in the literature, because there are gregarious animals versus ones that are not as gregarious, that screws the data. There are seasonal changes. If you put a camera near a fruiting tree, you get pictures of stuff every night compared to if you just face it the other direction. You know, you might get no pictures. So there's a lot of variation here, but I think interestingly, we compared two different situations, two sites, a very low hunting intensity site and a very high hunting intensity site in the forest that was surveyed in the rainy season. And then separately, we compared a site with medium hunting intensity and a site with high hunting intensity in the savanna in the dry season. So habitat and season were kept constant, and then we made comparisons between the two sites. Almost across the board, almost all of the game species were more abundant in the low hunting intensity sites when compared to high hunting intensity, although none of them in a statistically significant way. And it varied. Because the hunting intensity in the savanna was much closer than, so basically this site in the forest, nobody ever goes there. We went there to set camera traps. We compared to the highest hunting intensity that was in the whole study. So we saw more dramatic results compared to these two sites, which were much closer. And we also found that, like in the dry season, species like lowland paca, which you know is almost always associated with water, was significantly lower significantly higher at the high hunting intensity site, but this site was also along a major river. So there's sort of other variables that muddy what this data is saying, but I think it provided some interesting insights that we can talk about. One of the interesting things that we found is that collared peccaries were more abundant in the higher hunting intensity areas across the board. And one of the interpretations that we have in this data is that we had an overall lack of captures of white-lipped peccaries. So we only captured them at one site, and it was only one herd. This protected area should have very large herds of white-lipped peccaries because the hunting intensity and the human traffic is very low. The white-lipped peccaries have been experiencing rapid declines across their range, and people are trying to explain what's going on. Some people are theorizing that they're getting a disease from domestic swine or that something else is going on, but it's very unlikely that these species were hunted to local extinction. But we did see a cascading effect. The disappearance of this species, collared peccaries come in and fill that gap. We saw a similar thing with red-rumped agoutis, who have two species that are similar size and fill the same niche. The lowland paca is also a fruit eater, and the red akuchi is a small agouti who's also a fruit and seed eater. Paca and agouti are targeted by hunters, but akuchi is not. People don't waste their time because it's too small. And so we found that in areas where agoutis were affected by hunting in the high hunting intensity areas, akuchi relative abundance skyrocketed. And so seemingly relieved from some competitive effects, their relative abundance increased. We saw similar shifts and cascading effects in the activity pattern data. So across the board, all of the game species shifted their activity away from peak hunting times. The tapir and deer both shifted towards more, almost exclusively nocturnal activity in hunted areas, whereas in non-hunted areas, they would active both day and night. The peak hunting time that we found in our surveys was very early in the morning. So both collared peccaries and red-rumped agoutis shifted their activity away from those times, and lowland paca shifted their times towards dusk and away from that early morning. So seemingly everybody's shifting away from that activity in the very early morning. And then the red akuchi, which I said is a competitor with both the agouti and paca, we see that they're sort of in non-hunted sites, their activity pattern is in between. They're very crepuscular. So activities agoutis are active in the non-hunted site. Their peak of activity is right around dawn and then slopes off during the day. Lowland paca is the opposite. They're active right only at night, most active in the non-hunted site just after dusk. And akuchis find their temporal niche in between, being active in a crepuscular time. Since agoutis shift their activity away from this early morning activity, in the hunted sites, red akuchis are much more active during those morning hours when agoutis are seemingly avoiding hunters. And we found that the non-hunted species, so by percentage, the large-bodied species, tapir and deer, shifted their activity by about 20% towards more nocturnal activity. The medium-sized animals, agoutis, peccaries, and paca, shifted by about 10% in different directions. But akuchis and ocelots, which are unhunted species, both shifted their activities in hunted sites by about 30%, showing some cascading effects of these changes in activity and release from competition, and then filling in those gaps that are created. So our conclusion is that overall, our results reinforce the fact that tropical forests can support hunting intensity of around 1 person per square kilometer, which has been in the literature for 20 years now. We did, however, find that even though it wasn't statistically significant, we found a negative association between hunting intensity and occupancy for 3 species: the lowland paca, which is a species most preferred by hunters, the lowland tapir, and the giant armadillo, which are 2 species that are notoriously sensitive to hunting pressure, right? They're the largest body species, they're the slowest reproducing, they're both slow moving. Giant armadillos are easy to find because they make big dens, people can find them. Lowland tapirs can be called, I don't know if that's a universal thing, but hunters in Guyana can whistle, and I've been standing there as hunters have whistled tapirs right to your feet. And so people know how to do that and can hunt tapirs relatively easily. And so we found that those that potentially, even though this, as a general rule, this 1 person per square kilometer is a rule of thumb which may stand, that biology, these species that are especially sensitive, and hunter preference may matter, and that this data may serve as a warning or a suggestion for, there have been other scholars that have suggested that there may be no sustainable offtake of tapir because they're so large and slow reproducing. That this data supports that this is something that should be looked at, particularly in Guyana, where wild cow or bush cow is marketed openly as a common wild meat source. We also found that even though relative abundance and activity patterns can be criticized in the literature, we found that calculating those and comparing them to our occupancy data provided additional insights that helped us to interpret everything that was going on, and that the cascade incorporating carnivores, generalists like anteaters, and non-hunted species, this is gray-winged trumpeter, helped us to interpret the whole picture and to identify where these cascading effects were happening. I think a lot of monitoring programs will focus just on game species because those are the ones that are targeted, but I think incorporating a wide variety of species, especially in a camera trapping study that gets data on everything whether you want to or not, incorporating those species into your models can provide additional insights. And I think the correlation that we saw between what hunters were telling us in our surveys and what our data is telling us reiterates the importance of Indigenous knowledge in this whole picture. Not that it needed to be justified, that it, its accuracy needed to be justified, but I think it's a good reminder of that Indigenous knowledge tends to be left out of monitoring data, but for us, it played a critical role in when we were generating these models, spitting out all the data. When you're sitting in your office, you have no idea if the data, you're hopeful that the data is explaining what's really going on. But having this information and then having local hunters as co-authors as well that could verify the trends that we were seeing. We could say, as I was making trips back and forth, I could carry the data and explain, these are the trends that we're seeing. Does this make sense? Yes or no, or maybe, or I think so. People could talk to each other, and I think it, in the end, made for a stronger results that we're far more confident in than if we didn't have that part of the data. So that's it. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you to all of our funders, which included TCD, with very generous support. To all of our co-authors as well. Here's everyone here, including my beautiful wife. And all the communities. So the pool of co-authors was a much smaller group compared to everyone who contributed to the camera trap effort and the hunting, the resource use survey effort over time. So thank you to all of them. Hopefully this data will be useful, and I'm excited to bring it back to Guyana and do presentations like this to communities and government organizations, protected areas, and so on. And our group is active on social media, so if you don't follow us already, feel free. And I'm happy to take any questions.